Hello, everyone. My name is David Bernstein. I'm the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and this is the Jewish Contrarians podcast with my co-host, Brandy Shafatinsky, also my partner in thought crime. Hi, Brandy.
Hey, David.
So we're going to go over sort of a litany of culture war issues that continue to sort of dog the public conversation. And one thing that strikes me is that, there's been a bit of a thaw in the public discourse. It's easier to talk about some of these issues now than it might have been in months past. But it just keeps on getting crazier and crazier. I mean, it doesn't mean that there's less craziness involved. It means that two sides are trying to sort of drum out the other side or come up with simplistic solutions. And I want to sort of explore some of these binaries today in the discourse and some of the things that keep on popping up for us. And also just to sort of discuss what's on the docket. There are several issues that have been, discussed publicly in the last week or two. So let's hit on some of them. The first one I wanted to hit on is Starbucks. So Brandy, you'll remember because you live in Philadelphia. I think it was in 2018 when Starbucks kicked out two black men who were waiting, I think, for a friend. And that caused a big uproar and accusations of racism and the like. Just this week, a New Jersey court awarded a woman named Shannon Phillips, she's a white woman, with about $25 million settlement with Starbucks because she was fired by Starbucks. She was a regional manager and was fired by Starbucks. And it seems, according to the complaint, that Starbucks really wanted blood for what had happened. They wanted blood, and as a result, Starbucks district manager, I think it was a district manager, fired Shannon Phillips. Shannon Phillips was asked to fire another white employee that also wasn't the direct manager of that Starbucks as sort of a scapegoat. Refused to do so because the person wasn't actually guilty of anything, and then was fired herself for not complying with the original request. So this brought calls of hypocrisy on Twitter. Someone had tweeted out, one of our progressive friends had tweeted out that, look, the two men who were originally kicked out only got $1 in settlement. This woman gets $25 million. So, Brandy, what do you make of all this?
I think that the two settlements aren't necessarily related. I think that now whether the gentlemen that were kicked out of Starbucks, what seems like unlawfully and unreasonably, what they received for their settlement, if that was unfair, that doesn't mean that the courts should then go make or that Starbucks should go make another unfair decision. It also kind of reveals a little bit of not just the hypocrisy of a lot of the ideology that's pushing a lot of these initiatives, but it also I think unveils that it in fact is discriminatory in itself. And you have to wonder why somebody would be fired from their position for not doing something that is unlawful.
Yeah. So when I tweeted this out, I wasn't complaining that somehow white people have been historically discriminated against in the same way, black people are. And this is, but of course, that's the snark you immediately get on Twitter. Someone then tweets back and says, oh, yeah, white people really been discriminated against. What I was pointing out, and what the meaning of this is, at least for me, is that there are current practices, particularly under the guise of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that do engage in what would have been called discriminatory conduct. So when our friend Nicole Levitt was forced into an affinity group, a white affinity group, over her protestations at work, and that's a form of discrimination that would not be allowed if it were done to a black person or a protected class, and that should be deemed illegal under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In other words, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not make it so only certain groups of people couldn't be discriminated against. It protected entire categories. So, for example, you can't discriminate on the basis of race. It's not that you can't discriminate against Black people or Latino people. You can't discriminate against on the basis of race. And this ruling seems to have upheld that. Now, I have no opinion at all about whether or not $25 million is a reasonable punitive damage. It sounds very high to me. I imagine it could easily be overturned in a future court ruling, but I'm actually glad that the court ruled in our favor, because I don't think we want to see discrimination on the basis of race.
And I agree with you, and I think that the issue also there are a couple of things. One is are we making a distinction between justice and vengeance? And it sounds like, unfortunately, too many people, there are calls for vengeance under the guise of justice. And the other part is, I'm not surprised that she was fired, because when you have corporations and government agencies and other types of institutions adopting Kendi's rhetoric that the only way to address past discrimination is current discrimination, that's exactly what happened with Starbucks. That is exactly what they did, in my opinion, with this case. In order to address the discrimination that these two Black men faced, they chose to then discriminate against a white employee.
Right, which can't be legal and can't be acceptable. So I'm personally glad that the court found it the way it found it. But obviously, that doesn't mean that there's still no discrimination against Black people. And these men may have been discriminated against too. And we can deal with that on a separate track. They're not the same thing. All right.
Right. And the other part of that, David, is that firing somebody who had nothing to do with the way those men were treated in the Starbucks isn't justice for them. Or for anyone else that didn't do anything to correct the treatment that they faced.
Absolutely. All right, moving on. So there has been some interesting developments on the university diversity, equity, inclusion front this week. Two things that I wanted to point out, and we'll talk about. One is Arkansas University, I think University of Arkansas University, I'm not sure, decided to end its diversity, equity, and inclusion division, but at the same time, not fire all the employees, just reintegrate them into other departments with the university. Okay, so that's Exhibit A of this discussion. Exhibit B is that Governor Abbott of Texas just signed a bill that would have that bans DEI departments, period, in Texas universities. And this is a subject we've talked about on previous podcasts, and it seems like it's coming to a head. I think on the last time we discussed this, I expressed some support for the idea of banning DEI bureaucracies in universities. That doesn't strike me as a violation of academic freedom, because DEI is not academic freedom. It's a bureaucracy that the university establishes that's actually being used in some ways to limit academic freedom. So I was sort of a favorable. You convinced me that maybe in some cases DEI is not so bad, and maybe we should allow. I'll let you speak for yourself, but correct me if I'm misrepresenting you. That we should at least do, universities or states that are trying to impose this should at least do an assessment before they go ahead and ban DEI. Is that did I correctly represent your view?
Yeah, that's fair. And not only do an assessment before they ban it, but I think anyone who wants to bring aboard DEI should do an assessment before they implement it.
Right. So, yes, I'm not sure that's often done. So we have two approaches here. The Arkansas approach, which seems to be a better approach. It's not like we're saying that all the functions of DEI need to be summarily banned. It's saying that maybe it just shouldn't be organized in the way it has been, and we should keep some of these functions, but move them away from a bureaucracy that tends to be a source of groupthink and ideological indoctrination in the university. Did you like the Arkansas outcome?
I do, and I think that goes back to or can go, depending how it's enforced and enacted, go back to the original kind of setup of DEI. So human resources, student support services, Title IX offices, those all are there to achieve, I believe, the goals in a university setting that DEI offices or DEI officers should be making sure the university is in alignment with, especially when you're talking about civil rights and human rights and accommodations for students who may need some extra support. Having it as its own bureaucracy, we've seen, has led to a DEI office kind of running the other programming and having a little bit, in my opinion, too much power in the programming that actually those other offices should be doing.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it seems to me that this is another one of these sort of binaries in the discourse that were presented. Either that you think that everything a Governor Abbott or Ron DeSantis are doing is right, or you vociferously and vehemently oppose them. So for example, I'm very opposed to this idea of banning divisive concepts. That comes out of, I think that might have actually come out of Texas, but it's a similar ban that you see in Florida as well. That the idea is you can't talk about critical race theory, you can't talk about Ibram X. Kendi's work because it's a quote unquote divisive concept. And so therefore you have these broad bans against that. That to me seems like a blatant infringement of free speech and a violation, frankly, of the First Amendment. So I strongly oppose that. That doesn't mean, though, that the sort of scrutiny of DEI bureaucracies is similarly problematic. I know there's some people who argue that it is, but I at least think that they should be under scrutiny. And I would much prefer the approach of an Arkansas or what you had suggested as a sort of assessment of those programs than just blanket bans of these programs. What do you think?
No, I think that's fair, and I'm not surprised. I think that when anything goes too far to one extreme, we've seen that we're going to experience an extreme response. There will be a backlash, and unfortunately, I think that some of the rulings and policy decisions coming out of Texas and Florida are actually, they're the backlash that I've been expecting. The idea that DEI or divisive concepts or anything should be banned fundamentally sounds un-American. And a lot of the reason people still support those ideas is they also see that the rhetoric coming from their opposing side is also very un-American. And I agree with you. I think that banning any type of divisive concepts, who gets to decide what's divisive or not, especially in an institution of higher education where I would hope students would be hearing, learning, discussing, and debating all sorts of divisive concepts that helps fuel learning.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. While we're on the subject of bans, of course, there's the topic of book banning that we're constantly talking about today. I'm not sure these are really book bans in many cases. Like book banning historically meant that we were not going to allow a book to appear in the marketplace, and that's not what this is. We're dealing with two kinds of bans. One sort of in public libraries in general, and one is in public school libraries. And the one in public school libraries are often hard to sort of get your head around because it's not clear whether they're using an age-appropriate standard or whether they're actually trying to ban political speech. So I can think of a couple instances of this. One was the ban of a graphic novel of Anne Frank, a graphic novel version of Anne Frank. And the people from a sort of local chapter of Moms for Liberty wanted it moved out of the elementary school because it had some references to Anne Frank's homosexuality that are in one of the versions of her diary, one of the unadulterated versions of her diary. And they said, we're not opposed to the diary. Quite the contrary. We believe the diary should be in schools, but we just think that this graphical version sort of dumbs it down. That's what they say. And at the same time has inappropriate content. And so I don't know. It's hard to know what to make of that. Is that really a political ban in the way that we think of book banning, or is that just part of the ongoing discussion about what constitutes age-appropriate material?
I think it's representative of a struggle that we've had in the United States probably since the beginning of the United States, and that's really how do we address childhood. If you look at cases where children are so protected that they don't learn anything and they develop into adults who have very limited knowledge of the real world, or you look at other situations where you have kids who are exposed to anything and everything. And a lot of times the excuse is given, oh, they can look it up on the internet anyway. I believe personally, childhood is very short. Like in the scope of a human lifespan, childhood is very short. And I don't think that there's any reason to expose children to adult concepts. And we have data that shows age appropriate stages and developmental stages and when kids should be exposed to what. That's one thing. The other part is that it's really easy to get people fired up against something when you label it incorrectly, like labeling that as a book ban against Anne Frank. Now here, the story is out that these people don't want to teach about the Holocaust because they don't want a graphic novel about Anne Frank that gets into some sexual content in elementary school. They'd prefer to be moved to a middle school. Though that's not, it's not quite true. And I think that there's a little bit of deception in how it's been framed.
Yeah. So I think is it Amanda Gorman, the young woman who wrote a poem that was read in the inauguration of Joe Biden. Her poem, or book length version of her poem, was moved from the elementary bookshelf to the middle school bookshelf of a school. And this was yet another supposed book banning. Now, in both cases, by the way, I would oppose the change. Like, I would allow the graphic novel to be in the elementary school, and I would allow the poem to stay in there. But I'm not sure that and I don't like the process. If it's one parent who's supposedly, sounding an alarm at something, and then the entire school system goes into high gear to make sure that they're not offended, and as a result, no one has access to the book. I think that's not the right process for it. So that's a separate issue, but I don't know that constitutes book banning. And I think we're lumping in things. That doesn't mean that there aren't genuine book bans afoot. By the way, on both sides of the political spectrum, there are books that are being banned that shouldn't be banned on by the left as well. Certainly on the issue of gender. And there are books that are being curated by librarians that I think present a single political view on such subjects. I have no problem with a middle school librarian or a middle school principal not allowing the book Gender Queer, for example, to be in their bookshelves. That book presents graphic portrayals of oral sex and other things that I think a parent could easily say is just inappropriate for my kid. Now, I'm pretty permissive about what my own kids see, because I wouldn't mind my eighth grader seeing that. I would just talk about it with them. But I know that I don't represent every parent out there, and that's not the standard in society. And I think that you have a group of ideologues who are imposing their standards on people who don't share them. And I just don't think that that's the way you're going to see positive social change.
I also think that it's pretty ridiculous that book is being lifted up like it's so representative of the LGBT community. I think that it's rather insulting to think if I wanted, I'm a school librarian and I want to teach kids and have them exposed to the stories of women, am I going to use pornography to do that? Right. It's insulting. Now, and when you get into the conversation about sex, sexualization, that conversation has to involve both home and school. It always has. When I was in, fourth, fifth grade, that we did health and sex ed, there were kids that were opted out because their parents wanted to have those conversations with them by themselves without the school being involved. The idea that any teacher or school administrator thinks that they have the right to take that power away from a parent it's ridiculous to me.
Yeah. In Montgomery County Public Schools, where now I have no more children as of this May. Thank you. There was this fierce debate where Muslim parents want their kids to be able to opt out of the sort of gender studies discussions and in school. And, you have these Montgomery County school board members who are insisting that they not be able to opt out, that they have to learn exactly that. And there were huge protests. We've seen this also in Dearborn, Michigan, where parents in Dearborn, Michigan were up in arms. These are Muslim parents, traditional Muslim parents.
And in Glendale, where they're not necessarily Muslim, they're just religious, or they're more conservative.
Exactly. So it actually exposes a potential rift in the red-green alliance, as we say, between sort of Muslim groups and progressives. I mean, this is maybe a bridge too far for a lot of Muslim communities. So we're talking about binaries and how we're sort of forced into one side or the other on so many of these issues, and that the discourse doesn't allow for a lot of nuance on them. I want to talk about for a second the binary of binary, which is for us or against this dynamic around gender binary issues and gender ideology. So this last week, or just I think the last couple of days, there was a hearing on Capitol Hill in the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. Congressman Dan Crenshaw of Texas, Republican member, has introduced legislation that would deprive hospitals and universities and others, I believe, federal funding if they perform what's called gender-affirming care. In other words, they give either puberty blockers or cross-hormonal treatments to minors. And there was a hearing on this, and as you can imagine, this is sort of like front and center of the culture wars. And we saw this play out in several state legislatures, most notably in Missouri, where you had a Republican-dominated legislature that was trying to ban all gender-affirming care. And there were all these like 14 bills that were being discussed. And so I had this strange sense again that like we're forced into one or other box here. So on the one hand, Dan Crenshaw's bill is quite stark. It's saying like you must stop doing this now. And on the other hand, you have these people who are testifying who are insisting that the science is settled on gender affirming care for minors. So you had this Professor Meredith McNamara from Yale School of Medicine, and there's videos all over. So if you're looking for one, maybe we can put them in the show notes, Dan. If you're looking for one, we'll give it to you. But she's insisting that the medicine basically is settled on this. Dan Crenshaw is saying, I'm sorry, but there are dozens of studies that show that there can be problems in gender affirming care, and that we're not sure that it produces the health outcomes and reduces suicidality and the like that others are suggesting, that some are suggesting. And he points out that the UK's National Health Service just banned puberty blockers for minors after going through another systematic review of the literature. And you've seen similar systematic reviews of the literature in Finland and Sweden, and I think Norway as well. And these countries all conclude, and these are countries that were early in support of gender affirming care. They created the gender affirming care model in many ways. They're now backing away from it because the scientific literature goes in the opposite direction. And they're saying, and these people in the US are saying that you can't even discuss this, that the science is settled. So what do you make of this?
I think that it's kind of ridiculous that I saw clips of that testimony, and that physician to me was a bit of an embarrassment to the field, to our university. This isn't, and I'm just talking about data driven. We know the data on the physical harm and some data on the emotional harm puberty blockers actually lead to. Now, when people talk about gender affirming care, this is also where I get a little bit careful, want to slow the conversation down, because we need to talk about what does that mean? Does that mean that if, as a social worker, I'm seeing, a client and they ask me to refer to them by, this specific name and by specific pronouns, if we're banning gender affirming care, does that mean that I don't do that? I just want to go ahead and I'll refer to them by some other name and some other pronouns because gender affirming care is banned.
I don't think that I think that's social transitioning. I don't think that would fall under this. Just my thought. But even there, I would, yeah.
State boards of behavioral health have discussed this to the point where how they're defining gender affirming care is all of it. So a lot, and that's on the flip side. They say in order to be licensed by this state as a behavioral health, whether social worker, or therapist, psychologist, you have to abide by gender affirming care, which includes referring to clients by the pronouns of their choice, the name of their choice. So if a congressperson, a governor bans that, is that what they're banning also? Or are they strictly talking about medical procedures like puberty blockers?
Yeah. So let's assume for a second it's not the social transitioning that they're banning, but really puberty blockers and
Mhm.
cross hormonal treatments. And it seems to me even there, I'm not sure I want a bunch of Yahoo legislators from the state deciding to totally ban this. I know that there are protocols that are currently under in effect in certain European countries that allow that have a much more strict protocol about what kids get it. Like, I know that there are kids at age 2 or 3 who start to experience dysphoria that it's not sudden onset at all. It's something that they've experienced their whole lives. And I believe that there's room for them to get these hormones, but it should be after very rigorous review, and we should have a much better process. It can't be this automatic process of you expressing your gender. Kids know, teenagers know, and so therefore you're automatically going to give them whatever drugs they want because they know. To me, that's absurd.
I
So
agree. But I mean, there's also a state bill making its way through the legislature in California
yeah,
that says that if a parent doesn't affirm their kid's gender, that the state can remove that child from their home. That's ridiculously insane. And talk about government
yeah.
overreach.
Yeah.
That's
So you have in one state or two states, any parent who tries to get their kids gender affirming care can lose their parental rights, and another state that would end parental rights if they refuse to go along with their kids getting gender affirming care. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Like, and I just, we have to be able to talk about these things. It can be true. Two things can be true. One is that I don't want Missouri state legislators making the setting policy here. I'm not even sure I want the House member. Maybe the House can do Congress can do some oversight of it, but I don't necessarily want them to withdraw federal funds from any hospital. I just want there to be an open discussion where the medical bodies are depoliticized, where we can actually do a systematic review of the research and talk about it publicly without being called a transphobe. And not I don't want to necessarily go with one side or the other on this. And I'm told that if I don't toe the line on gender affirming care, then I'm automatically on the side of Dan Crenshaw or the Missouri House legislature. And I just think that that's really not what we want. And we can articulate a third way. I refuse to go along with that binary. What about you?
No, it's a same. I mean, as an American, I tend to lean away from any type of authoritarianism or totalitarianism. And right now, I think on the extremes of both sides, that's what we're seeing, where a government is going to tell you what to do with your child on one side. The other part is that if our medical professionals aren't relying on proven scientific data, or they're not even open to having a discussion and exploring it, we have a problem.
We have
And
a problem.
I can understand a governmental agency that actually has oversight on what funds those things, not wanting to fund an institution that isn't willing to do the research that should be done. Kids shouldn't be guinea pigs on either spectrum. I don't, again, going back to
Right.
the struggle, I think we have a little bit American culture with childhood and appreciating it is I don't understand in this whole conversation and tug of war with all of these things, whether it be about race and racism or education or gender and sexuality, kids seem to be at the forefront of it all, where they're the guinea pigs, they're the test cases. And I think it's not fair. And I think it's ridiculous.
Yeah, you have a group, just to play devil's advocate for a second, you have a group of ideologues who believe that we've been indoctrinating kids in the gender binary their whole lives, starting with age, when they come out of the womb, that they're being told that that you're either a man or a woman, and that's harmful. And as a result, we have to social engineer the opposite starting in kindergarten. We have to, as soon as we have the opportunity to do so, we have to let them know that that's a false binary, and we have to make up for the hundreds and hundreds of years of miseducation. That's what their program is. And they're running it. I mean, like, there was some new polling on this. It's actually losing ground. I mean, it's never been popular, but it's actually losing ground. I don't know how you push something that's probably like 3/4, if not more, of American society opposes, and insists that has to be taught as gospel in schools. I just can't imagine that that's going to enjoy much support. So
what worries me about this is similar to what worried me about when we were discussing what happened with Starbucks, is that, and we're seeing it now, the backlash against the questions and conversations about gender identity, are the people that are feeling and suffering the backlash are the gay and lesbian community.
Yeah.
Because now all of a sudden support for equal rights for gays and lesbians is dropping. And like every time something comes up where there's one extreme that is trying to drag the country one way, there's going to be a backlash. And I think we're seeing that with this, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's right. It's hurting the cause of gay rights in many ways, not broadening it. It's actually potentially going to limit it. I think that we were going to raise another topic or so, but I think we've sort of hit a few key ones in the culture wars this week. Unfortunately, the culture wars show no sign of subsiding, and I think we're going to have plenty of contrarian debate fodder in the weeks to come. So, wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.